my friends, and welcome back to Where Wendy Creates. Today we are going to go ahead and put a border on our baby quilt, and then it's ready to be quilted or long arm quilted. So let's go ahead and put our borders on our baby quilt. One great thing about doing a baby quilt is typically, or a toddler quilt, typically the size of the quilt is smaller than one length of fabric. An average length of fabric is about 40 inches, give or take, could be 36, could be 42, but the average length of fabric is about 40. So we know that our toddler quilt, we can use one length of fabric to do our borders. And we're going to go ahead and use this beautiful pre-cut 2.5 inch blue strips to make our baby quilt border. So we can go ahead and choose one side. I like starting at the bottom, and this is a directional quilt because you see some of the pattern goes upright. And we're going to go ahead and start at one side. We're going to determine which is the front and which is the back, what is the top and what is the back of our 2-inch strip. And we're going to trim off our selvage, and we're going to go ahead and go face to face around the length of our quilt. But before we do that, we have red thread. We want to go ahead and remove the wrong color thread and thread our machine with the correct colors. I do have white in the bottom, and this is a very pale quilt. White will work perfect for that, but I want to go ahead and change the top to a more similar color. I'm going to go ahead and use blue because we're sewing on the blue to the quilt, and I'm going to make sure the thread comes off the top of my spool of thread as I put it on. I'm going to put my little spacer or my grabber on there so it holds the thread. I'm going to go through the arrows on the top of the machine, down, up, around the top knob, then back through the 2 holders by the needle. I'm going to go ahead and trim off a piece of the thread, and then we're going to thread the needle. Now, if you need further instructions on that, please, I've done a couple of tutorials on how to thread your machine, and this is one of the machines I did thread. So you can look back at those previous videos and get a closer look at threading the machine. Now, the baby quilt is all pressed, so we can go ahead and start sewing. Our seams are laying down properly, and I want to do a nice 1/4 inch for my binding. I'm going to start and reverse, lock in that stitch as I start. We're going to throw the binding, the quilt down, have it level with the machine. Part of it's in my lap. And we're going to go across the bottom. And on this baby or toddler quilt, it is longer than it is wide. So we are starting with a shorter side because we're going across the bottom. And once we have this sewn, we can go back to the ironing board. We will press the seams open, and then again, any tidy up, removing threads, pressing any other seams that need to be pressed, and then it'll be ready for our long arm quilter. And then we'll change the needle in our project because we'll have one project done. And I do like to change needles between each project. And right now, it sounds like my table is bouncing too much, but we're gonna go ahead and keep going, maybe bring it over a little bit, has a little bit more stability there. And see if it doesn't make a little bit less sound. Interesting. And we're making sure that the edge of our binding and the edge of our quilt are together and that the seams are laying straight as they were pressed. When we make sure all the seams are laying right, that just eliminates some of the bulk So later when we're going over the 3 layers, it's 4 or 5 layers. It's not more than that. And with the sound, I'm just going to work on my tension. I believe the tension is off a little bit, so we're going to go ahead and tighten the tension just a little bit, and that should help with our sewing. Much better. Okay, and we're coming up to the edge of our quilt. And you could have trimmed the 2.5-inch strip prior, or just trim it now. I'm going to lock stitch that at the very end. Then we're taking it off. We can bring it over to the cutting board and we can trim that, or we can lay it flat in our fingers and go ahead and trim off that excess piece. Now what I didn't do is go ahead and measure again. So we're going to take a width of fabric, 2.5-inch strip, and we're going to measure it down the quilt, make sure that it is long enough, or else we'll go ahead and piece it together before we do that border, so that way we can control where that seam lays before we sew it on. And we're just doing a rough piece down. And because of the selvage, I'm actually an inch off. I am actually an inch off. So we're going to go ahead and take this piece and sew it on. Make sure I have right sides together, because we want to go over this as well, this full piece. So let's go ahead and cut off the selvage on this side. We definitely don't need that extra bulk. Trim our threads. And sew our fabric face to face. So we've got that extra bit, and I'm going to put the part that we sew together, I'm going to end that near the bottom of the quilt, so it's not at the top where it's readily seen all the time. And I did break my thread. Okay, so we have sewn our seam together, and I've finger pressed it open. And we're going to go ahead and put right sides together and go ahead and sew down the quilt. And one thing I did notice is my thread was a glazed thread, and that seemed to change the tensions. So I've gone back to a cotton non-glazed thread, and it's a little bit smoother, I think. Okay, so again, right sides together, we've pressed our seams open so that we only have the 2 layers of thickness going through, not more. And then we're laying out the quilt, keeping the top edge going, the bottom is in our lap, and we're just gonna keep on going down, or I should say up, one side of our quilt. Want the top row to be one continuous piece of fabric, just like the bottom. So we are going to use one width of fabric across the top, and then use the little part that we trim off as the bottom segment for the other side of the quilt, because it is a little bit longer. It is toddler size. And I am really loving this quilt. One of these days I'm going to get on a real table so the table doesn't bounce as much as this card table. But right now the card table is convenient. sewers use what we have, don't we? All right, we're coming up onto the top. And again, at each of the seams, I'm just making sure that they're laying properly according to the way that they were ironed. Looks like these last two want to tucker, so we pull that back under, make it smooth. Double check on that last seam that seamed. Everything wanted to lay right except for the last two seams. Okay. And because we only needed 1 inch and we used a much longer piece, I do have some on the quilt of the border here that I am going to trim off. So again, I can bring that over to the cutting board. I don't need to trim it till I press it, but I do need to trim it before we put the top piece across. So I'm just going to lay this over flat. Take a look how it lays on the quilt. I'm going to make sure it's not being pulled or torqued, and then I'm going to cut it even. Again, if you're not comfortable doing that, please, please, please go ahead, press this one line that we've just sewn, bring it over to the cutting board, trim this piece off. We can set it aside for another project, and then we can open it up, and we're going to do the other side before we do the top. So let's go ahead and trim that, or add that one piece that we just trimmed off onto a full length of fabric to do the other side before we do the top of the quilt. And we're making sure we have right sides together on the 2.5 inch strip to 2.5 inch strip. And we're going to go ahead and sew that on. Now I'm going to trim the extra threads, trim the extra selvage, so we don't need that. And then we're going to take it, we're going to finger press this piece open. So again, when we sew, we'll be sewing over 2 pieces, not the 4 or the 3 with the selvage laying to one side. So see how we finger press that together? Now we're going to go ahead and start at the bottom of the quilt. Again, it is a directional quilt, so we can easily tell what's the bottom. And we're going to go ahead and put face to face and sew with the seam being closer to the bottom. We're going to flip this all around so we can sew this up. Like to lay it in my lap so that the bulk is right there with me, and I can pull up just enough to balance so that none of the fabric is torqued as I start to sew. And we're using a cut piece, so lining that up, not worrying about the selvage because that's already taken care of. And somehow I undid the top of my machine again. So let's go ahead and rethread. And that's going to happen if you don't use like a little tail, a little piece of fabric to put the, to sew on a little bit just to hold it, or if you don't hold it with your fingers like I was not holding it with my fingers there. So we're going to stick that thread back through the needle, pull it back through, back with the underlying bobbin thread, and I'm going to hold these 2 pieces as I start, and that way I will not lose my thread again. And just a couple of stitches and it'll stay put. All right, so let's make sure we're perfectly lined up. And that our seams are all laying flat the way they were pressed and ironed to do. And rechecking as you go, making sure all the seams are laying flat and that you're still edge to edge. this is the one, when we trim off the bottom of this side, we will not need. So we can set it aside. Just guide it with your hand as you go. To back stitch at the end just to lock in that stitch, and then again I can take it to the iron and press it, or I can just simply fold it over, trim it off like I did the other. And then we just have the top to do, and this quilt is ready to press and go to be quilted. Yay! All right, looking great. And I am jingling here. Okay, so right sides to right sides. Let's grab another 2.5 inch strip. Right sides to right sides, and we will go across the top. We want to make sure we're not using that selvage. Definitely don't need that selvage. Locking in that stitch as I start. Making sure we're moving with the needle and the foot so that we're not pulling it, not torquing it, not twisting it. It doesn't have too much weight on it to pull the fabric any other direction. And we keep realigning as we go. Just like this, my friends, we have a border on this quilt. Now, I do love borders. A lot of people don't use borders. But when you have a picture you love, don't you frame it? I love borders. 1 border, 2 borders, 3 borders, it's wonderful. It's also a nice way to make that quilt a little bit larger. Got about 4 inches more to go, and then we trim. All right. And there we go. Our quilt is done with our borders. So let's go ahead and trim off this last border. Then we'll take it over to the ironing board, press it, and then we can long arm quilt it, which I hope to show you as well in the future. I hope you love it. I love it. I cannot wait to make another. So subscribe if you haven't, because we have a few more baby quilts to make in the next couple of months. See you real soon.